Greetings, ladies and gents, and welcome to the latest chapter of Ars Magica, taken from the subreddit HFY. All the relevant links are down below, and please like, comment, and subscribe like any good minion of the algorithm would do. And as always, I hope that you enjoy. I would just like to thank the following Tier 5 patrons and channel members for supporting the channel: Fallen Angel, Buzz Kennington, Data Magnet, and Bob the Dragon. Thank you again. And now, on to the story. Chapter 14. Excerpt from a treatise on classes granted by divine grace to Xanthus in his 23rd year as a priest of Naron. There are some rather specific issues which must be overcome and requirements which must be met for an individual to receive a specialized class. Unless, of course, they somehow chance upon it by pure luck, as is the case has sometimes been. The first issue is that no one actually knows how to receive a class, unless they have one of 5 resources available to them. There could be the voice of God, actively trying to help an individual, or something like an apostle, devout, priest, or even cleric. Information might be available from a library or bookstore where an inquisitive and dedicated searcher might find a book regarding a class, or, in rare cases, classes, which has its requirements previously discovered and documented. One might be able to find the requirements stored in a church athenaeum previously dictated by a god that was discovered by a devout worshipper, and then annotated and preserved by the priesthood. A god might grant knowledge directly to a blessed and devout individual, such as one who's worshipped hard enough. Finally, a truly lucky individual could be a part of an ancestral tradition or familial class. There are, of course, additional hurdles to finding a specific class using these methods. Most quests that are given by voice of the gods, or by the gods themselves, do not necessarily allow an individual to accomplish the requirements for the class they desire. Most quests just allow an individual to obtain generic class, get better equipment, or even just acquire money. It is almost unheard of for a quest to be geared towards the class that the individual would like, unless that individual had found an acolyte or apostle of HIATUS. Those instances pertaining to the voice of gods have been known to have some amount of influence being put upon them from the acolytes previously mentioned. However, those certain voices of the gods, once identified, were quickly snatched up and sequestered or paid extremely well by high-ranking officials, and others who have copious amounts of money. There are, of course, other less influential voices of the gods, costing less, but having different set of problems associated. Most generic priests are not inclined to just hand over the secrets that they've acquired from their respective gods, although, while most that are willing to give them up have cost less than the acolytes of HIATUS, they are still not cheap, and also have far less influence on the contents of their god's class message. Additionally, the priests may have been expressly forbidden from sharing the specifics of the class that they have knowledge on. Finally, some priests aren't really of the helping sort, and the individual might just have an easier time surviving in a domain. The same limitations hold true for searching for a church athenaeum. The other options become progressively more complicated though. Most towns, even if they have a library or bookseller, are not going to just store a random book titled How to Acquire a Class, let alone the specific class the individual desires. Even major cities are unlikely to have such a rare book sitting on the shelf. People in general also come with their own considerations as well. For example, in a certain farm village, there could be a person that has obtained the farmer class. Well, they are more willing to give out the requirements which led them to the class, as it is most likely would be an easy class to obtain. There are other classes whose requirements might not be hard or easy enough to warrant the class. On the other hand, for a more high-classed individual, such as an archwizard, may not like the requirements being widely distributed, as I feel that it could cause unknown destruction upon the country that they reside. The requirements themselves put certain type of person into them, and any other that tries will inevitably fail or die. Or it could be any of the other variety of reasons, be they personal or not. Even if the individual finds a church of a god who is willing to grant the knowledge of the class requirements, if the individual's soul was pledged to another god at their birth, had a previous consideration towards certain ideology, or the individual just does not mesh with that god's realm of influence, they might not hear any response, even with their most devout of prayers. In some cases, the individual might even be cursed for trying. Luckily, such restrictions can often be easily overcome by doing a series of dedicated services for that god. Unfortunately, getting the class specifics from that god might not even be possible even then. If the god which the individual spent time in the service of is part of a certain aspect or realm of influence, they still might not be able to provide the requirements for the class which falls under the auspice of another god's realm of influence. This, of course, leaves the most reliable but least controllable way to gain a class, dependent completely on the luck of the draw. Familial classes which can be passed down are extremely hard to obtain. Families which have met certain class requirements often collect the first legendary class of that kind, and such families can often and do set their own conditions as to whom the class can get passed on to. The usual requirements, although not absolute, is that the recipient be a kin who has completed a number of tasks set to them. This does tend to avoid the class being passed on to the less desirable candidate, like a murderer who is now trying to become a holy warrior, whose aspect is of bronze, but can also lead to the requirements for the class being lost to slight alterations in tradition. Eventually, the tradition shifts too much. The actual requirements are no longer part of the activities, and the class is lost to that family. Most legendary classes are no longer available due to such mistakes, lost in time and translation. All of these hardships, complications, and other difficulties lead to one reason why historians are often sought. Historians are bestowed with the ability to look into the past by their god, Neron. No one is exactly certain how, but based on hints accidentally dropped by certain historians, some speculate that Neron literally places a copy of his tomb in the heads of those chosen to be his historians, although he only ever allows them to look at a few pages at a time. This is, as it sounds, more of a hindrance than anything else until the historian gains the experience needed to pass and search through the contents and find the pages with the desired information. This often takes at least 50 years before the historian is able to find specific information on request. One historian described it as searching for information on Lord Father and instead putting up a scene of a woman gardening, watching a random court case for a taxable carriage, or a man just baking some bread. Because of this difficulty, some historians can go a little crazy. If the god someone worships gives that person a skill which randomly makes them believe that they are a different person every time they try to use it, more often than not, that person will get lost in time, as it were. If they delve too deep, they might even come back believing themselves to be the baker of yore. Often, this isn't too big of a deal, unless they unfortunately go through the events of the collapse of Joran from the eyes of the conqueror Sovnak, or are put through an event of sudden, inexplicable assault. Then they could turn into a murderer, a crying mess, or someone completely insane. Now, I'd advise each and every one of you reading this to take the time and thank the gods that there are no more absolute insane people in the world than there already is. Gods know that it's basically all up to them whether or not we get murderers with access to all of our abilities inside of our heads, all the time. He had heard that historians were an odd bunch, prone to losing themselves in the past that they searched. Unfortunately, that is exactly what Garong had to deal with. The historian he hired was supposed to look into the class that was his family's legacy and find the actual requirements, or even just instructions to get to the requirements. From Garong's long-dead great, however many greats grandmother, Selesh Fortin. As far as he could figure out, she was the only one in his family to have gotten the legendary class, but it had never gotten passed on. Sure, the class wasn't the greatest, nor was it the most powerful, like a sage or a conqueror, but it was called a legendary class for a reason. From what his family had taught him, it had the potential to overturn entire kingdoms if used right. So, when he finally was able to get away from his family, leave his town, and journey until he finally found someone who could give him the cold, hard facts, it was understandable that he wanted to absolutely murder the possessed man that had been in front of him. Historians were, as he found out, expensive to get, and then cost even more to actually make sure that they didn't become the very thing the hires sought. His historian had almost guaranteed that he wouldn't get lost in the time finding his information, and had thus charged him extra. However, when he had received his ungodly amount of payment, in Garung's eyes at least, his historian had managed to become Selesh, which complicated matters a tad. Garung had no idea when the original mind would come back, nor could he, as only Naron could be able to coax it back with the help of some other gods of mind. So he was forced to grovel, lick, work, and all other sorts of menial things that he had thought he left behind in his old home, before the hag-possessed man even released any information. However, at this point, he had managed to get the information on all the requirements that he needed for his class. Thankfully, he had already met most of them, according to the local analyst. He had met the strength requirement of 50. He had managed to acquire the prerequisite class of Beast Tamer a long time ago. He had managed to reach the class of level 50. He had also been able to reach a constitution of 25. All that was left was an event requirement. At first, Garung couldn't really understand what that kind of thing would be, or even could be. Selesh was apparently prohibited from saying what exactly the event had to accomplish was. From her understanding, based on her experiences, the event could literally be anything, as long as it had to do with the class, and the voice of the gods recognized it as such. She could only provide her own experience, although she wasn't sure if they were still applicable in this place and time. For her event, she had subjugated and tamed the majority of the white-furred Yetish population that lived amongst the mountains. She had told him that she was unsure whether or not it was the location, the creature in question, or even the time in which she lived that allowed her to be granted the class. But from the story, Garung had thought that he'd figured it out. To become a Beastmaster, one must simply control the entire population of the beasts within an area. That was what felt right to him. That was the course he felt he had to take, and for the past couple months, he had driven himself to do so. He didn't know if the quality of the beast had any impact or not, but he figured given his abilities, there was only really one thing that he could do. He had to travel to a domain of a god. He figured if he was able to capture the entire population of a beast within a domain, he could outdo his ancestor, and probably gain access to an even better legendary class. Something told him that that was the right course of action. So he headed to the second nearest domain that he knew of, Growit's Caldara. Growit's Caldara was, in fact, one of the domains of Marank, which he surmised would be teeming with monsters and beasts. It also came with a better caveat than the actual nearest domain. That one was the domain of Daryl, which would have come with the caveat that a person was stuck within the domain until the person could destroy, beat all of the things that existed within that domain. This sometimes included other people who had found themselves stuck inside the dungeon. At least Marank's caveat, you cannot leave until you've shed copious amounts of blood, left Garung with the possibility of survival, rather than putting him up against other people whose classes might outshine his own. So, once he reached the domain, he tried to find a relatively good beast to capture. Sure, he could go for capturing and taming the entire population of Trats, and while that would be safer to do, he wanted something interesting, something that screamed him. He had waited nearly 2 whole days trying to make a decision before he was approached by a lone wolf. It was bleeding heavily from its leg, and due to the copious amounts of fur surrounding its head, you could not even see its eyes anymore. He saw an opportunity then, so he tamed it, healed it, and hunted for more of its kind. It was slow going, of course, as in the beginning he only had the one. but eventually he had ended up with around 50. And judging from the wolf's information, there was only one other population of them within this domain. This one, however, was certainly the largest, at around 25 individuals. They clashed with them, managed to kill some, but obtained 3 more. However, recently, his quarry eluded him. He had been stuck for a couple weeks trying to find the last vestiges of the population. At some point, he would find traces of them, paw prints in the mud, some kills strewn about in haste, being left behind, that kind of thing. It was only when he saw tracks leading further into the cave, into the side of the Growit's Caldara, he knew that he had them cornered. They were essentially trapped between joining him, fighting him, or taking their chances with the advanced beasts further within. And thus he brought his entire might with him. All of his wolves backed him, as they fought their once brethren. His skills allowed him to enhance the strength and agility of most of his subordinates quite noticeably, as well as allowing some of them more fighting prowess. Sure, he had been stuck at his class's max level for a while now, but there was a reason that most parties had wanted him specifically on their team. His skills mostly relied on strengthening others, rather than himself, sure. But his raw level and his stat values were so high that he could manage most other people one-handed. As more and more wolves were brought under his influence, he could feel the changes happening. His breadth of power was expanding, and the class he had was slowly becoming more. Then he felt it slow and stop. It was done. Even with all the fighting that his wolves were doing, and all that was left, his class had finalized. He was now, and would forever be, a Beastmaster. His moment of elation, while great, was perhaps a bit too short, he surmised, as, with his new senses and class benefits, he could tell that something was casting magic behind him, and it was closing fast. He turned around and caught the forearms of he wasn't really sure what it was. It kind of looked like an LOA, except wasn't. With a bit further inspection, he noticed the ears were shorter and quite a bit more round. It had a weird nose type he wasn't familiar with. Whether or not this thing was intelligent, he couldn't be sure. Many monsters and beasts had the ability to camouflage as a sapient and trick the prey into walking into their mouths. So he wasn't too sure on that front. What he could tell about it, however, was that the magic was surrounding its hands. That was a staple for any magical trap that he'd seen back when he was part of a team. Whenever they made a mistake or tripped something up, an arrow, a spear, or even a bolt would appear to stab this inside of you. This magic causing instant decay. Thus, the only remains you would see would eventually be rotting flesh, bones, or even dust depending on the severity. The severity of this magic would have turned him to bones. He grinned at the thing in front of him. Whether or not it was intelligent or a beast, it was no matter. This thing could survive the rigors of decay. That in and of itself was something worth noting. He had not heard of anyone who had been able to cast it without suffering some debilitating illness or disease which killed in a couple weeks, days, or hours depending on the severity being used and how much it had been used. And this thing, this wonderful thing, had managed to do it without spitting up blood or causing its hands to deteriorate besides a few skin flakes. Whatever the case may be, this thing had attacked him, and he was going to have it. So without further ado, he jabbed his hand straight through the thing's stomach, before having his arm retreat back just as fast. With a baleful cry, the thing fell to the floor, its magic destabilizing. That's the thing with mages, though, Grunk thought. You interrupt their casting with a big sensation and it goes poof. Unfortunately, it wasn't a big a problem as he thought it would give the thing. Apparently, the thing had regeneration. Sure, it wasn't exactly the fastest, but the fact that it still had it said a fair bit about it, especially since it had stopped bleeding out of the orifice rather quick. You've got a nice body, don't you? Why don't you fall under me then? He activated his animal submission skill, but it didn't seem to affect the thing, although he did see a slight wince on its face. So, you've also got mental resistance skill, I take it. A bit bothersome for me, but that's perfectly fine. The thing about resistance is... Garong leans in closer, his nose almost touching. Resistance falls eventually. So, that's where he stayed, continuously pouring on the effects of his skill. Every so often, the thing would try and run away, just like it had the first time, but Garong would just stab it in the stomach again to keep it in front of him. Sure, it was an effort to continuously pour the skill into the thing, but Garong wanted to test his new Beastmaster skills upon it once it became his. With the effects he could pile onto this thing, it would be a formidable siege weapon. Sure, he might have had to pull his attention away after a while. The wolves, without constant supervision, were more than likely to just fail at their given tasks without constant monitoring. The wolves may have been smart, but it wasn't like they had any knowledge of tactics. It was to a few of these questioning sensations that he got over the link that made him look away from his current task, to find that, yes, the plant thing was still at large. He hadn't known when it had arrived, nor why it started attacking the wolves only he had, but he was sure of one thing. He couldn't tame a plant. He tried multiple times, but the effect seemed to slide off of it. He made sure to tell the wolves that, while ripping and tearing were good options, why not take it to one of the cavernous pits around here that one of the turned wolves had passed on information about. However, looking away from the thing that he was trying to subdue was almost the most costly mistake in his short career as a legendary class. He couldn't tell when the thing had gathered energy, nor when the spell actually activated. All he could tell was that in one moment he was fine, and in the next there was a spear going through his chest. Thankfully, it wasn't near any vital organs, like the heart, but it did somehow just appear in his stomach. With a sigh, Garong removed the spear and shaped flesh so that no intensive bleeding would happen. His pack was outside the cave at the moment, and that was where he kept his potions. He could always shape the flesh with his affinity, but that didn't really help grow any back. More often than not, that would just delay the problem, as all the bleeding had basically been turned into internal bleeding. He had to give props to the thing. He had entirely forgotten that this particular spell existed. It had been a while since he started out, and most people didn't really look into the various variations that magically conjured weapons could take besides a sword and a bow. He had only ever seen one instance of a magic spear in the capital, and even then it didn't seem all that impressive. He only realized now that that was the point. He turned around to face the thing, only to find it was already in his face, and the punches it did, while not really all that heavy, had been laced with enough speed that it didn't really matter what kind of strength was behind it. He was being turned into mincemeat after just a few seconds. That would not do. He had already conquered most of the wolf population here. It was fine to send some in between him and his adversary. This, however, turned out to be another costly mistake. He never specified which ones, so it was up to them to decide. That, with their built-in loyalty to him, had made all the wolves stop what they were doing, turn towards the battle, and abandon all other actions that they had been pursuing. This, while helpful towards his personal fight, did give breathing room to the other wolves in the cave, the ones that he was here to subjugate in the first place. So, while taking a breather, they all rallied behind the plant, before coming together as one towards the new battle. This, however, would also take a bit of time to organize. Enough time for something interesting to happen. You see, most weapons that are conjured by magic tend to not stick around for long. Most people don't really have the finer amounts of control necessary to continuously pump their weapons for the duration that they wanted it. Most people that had access to enough mana to generate a mana weapon weren't really warrior material. Sure, most adventurers could have magic that they're capable of using, but more often than not, that was just a ratio trick, or an item that could produce the effect, never actually magic conjured by a person. Sure, some were willing to obtain magic, even with the chance of magical dissemination that could happen from time to time. But almost all who would go through it successfully were scholars who had the knowledge to do so, as well as the knowledge to stay away from battle. Most adventurers who even had access to magic mostly did it so that they would not have to rely on potions anymore. Plus, it was more of a case that most people never had affinities for healing magic. That's when magic weapons came in. If you figured out what the spell actually does, if you had enough magical control, you could change the purely magical weapon to take on one of your affinities. This leads most people to secretly conjure a sword of fire, a bow of wind, or some other nonsense. If anyone did see, they would most likely just say that they had to learn a different spell. Only if you looked into the book relating to the subject would you actually see that it could do that. But as it always has been, most adventurers weren't really keen on spending their time in a library, unless it was to look up a new combo that they could perform with their given skills. No, more often than not, they'd be out hunting bandits, destroying roaming monsters, or getting rid of some dungeons. That was why it came as a complete shock to Garong that the spear that the thing had held did not fade away, and also seemed to utterly destroy his buffed-up walls. Sure, adding 100% strength and health to a target creature of your choice was an excellent idea for buffers. But when it came to it, in the raw, magical aspect, it didn't stand a chance against something which turned your muscles into dust within 5 seconds of contact. So Garong did the best thing he could do, since he noticed that his entire army was so dumb as to continue running headlong into being wiped out by one person with a spear. He ran. Well, getting that thing would have been nice, he thought. I'd much rather live to see another day now that I've gotten my legendary class. And if he had anything to say about it, that would be it. He would have run out of the cave, chugged a couple potions, and went back to civilization, and start taming the thing a beastmaster was known for taming: dragons. Sure, he would have definitely gotten better equipment for the task, as well as a couple people to back him up, like in his adventuring days, back when he actually got him money. Unfortunately, that path might be closed to him, as the plant creature was currently between him and the door. Thankfully, he had one thing that he could use. It would mean not being able to use it during his first dragon taming, but right now he figured the situation called for it. So, with a heavy heart, he activated his speed talisman. His body suddenly felt so energetic, like he could control every fiber of his being to motion. But he knew that it was just a sudden change doing things to his perception. So, with his advanced speed, he ran under the plant thing's legs and jumped on top of the wolf behind it, to finally put himself in an advantageous position. Unfortunately, that's when the Stalem burst from the ground. For all of those who don't spend much time in caves, a Stalem is basically a monster that camouflages itself as a stalagmite. When prey gets close, it basically pokes its head out and tries to eat it. This, of course, would be much scarier to the average person, if the thing wasn't the size of the average foot. It was meant to eat small lizards or bugs after all, not people. So, for whatever reason, the Stalem thought that it would be high time to check if any bugs were nearby. This had the unfortunate side effect, at least for Garong, to cause him to rip the monster in half with his leg and trip into the ground. This was enough for the plant thing to catch him and begin to strangle him. It wasn't really strong enough to do so, however, only enough to keep him in place. That was when Garong noticed something rather peculiar about his surroundings. He could no longer hear any of the mental conversation. No one was asking for his help. This could only mean one of two things. If he had been in his right mind, he would have figured it out. However, with the talisman pumping energy into his body, he could only think that his beasts were coming to his aid. Unfortunately, reality had gone the other way, and so he was unprepared for what came next. It came as a complete surprise to him when he turned his head away from the plant, only to find a serrated spear tip 5 centimeters away from his face. Then he was no longer able to think of anything at all, as it all faded to black. End of chapter. And that, my friends, concludes this video. I hope that you enjoyed, and if you do, please consider supporting the author, even by popping over and leaving a thumbs up or a nice comment, just to show your appreciation for the story. However, if you wish to support this channel, there are links down below which will help immensely. I will see you all in the next one, and until then, I hope that you have a fantastic day. Cheers.